For a brief moment, the survival of the world depended on a decision that was never supposed to exist. There are moments in history that appear stable, not because they were safe, but because nothing went wrong. Moments where the world survives not through wisdom, but through luck, hesitation, or a single decision made at the very last possible second. In October of 1962, humanity came closer to destruction than it ever truly understood. The world remembers how the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, but history rarely asks a far more dangerous question. What if it hadn't? In the early 1960s, the world existed in a state of permanent tension, a fragile balance maintained not by trust, but by fear, as two superpowers watched each other across oceans, continents, and ideologies, both convinced that a single mistake could end everything they knew. This was not a world at peace. It was a world holding its breath. The United States and the Soviet Union were no longer simply rivals competing for influence. They had become reflections of opposing worldviews, each convinced that the survival of its system depended on the failure of the other. To compromise was to appear weak. To hesitate was to invite collapse. This belief shaped every military plan, every political speech, and every technological race of the era, turning diplomacy into performance and preparation into obsession. Nuclear weapons had transformed war into something unrecognizable. Conflict no longer unfolded on battlefields, but inside command rooms where men in uniforms and suits debated abstract concepts like deterrence and escalation, fully aware that their decisions could erase cities they would never see and lives they would never know. Distance no longer offered safety. Geography no longer guaranteed protection. By 1962, both sides possessed enough nuclear firepower to destroy each other many times over. And yet, paradoxically, this overwhelming capacity for destruction was believed to be the very thing that prevented war. The logic was simple and terrifying. If both sides understood that no one could win, then no one would dare to begin. A doctrine built on the assumption that rational actors would always pull back before crossing the final line. This assumption was called stability, but stability was an illusion. Beneath public speeches and carefully staged diplomatic smiles, both sides prepared relentlessly for the possibility that the other would act first. Rapid response systems were developed to eliminate hesitation. Weapons were deployed forward to reduce warning time. Contingency plans multiplied, compressing decision-making windows from hours to minutes, and sometimes to seconds. With every technological advancement, the margin for error grew smaller. Human judgment was gradually replaced by procedures, protocols, and machines designed to respond faster than fear could think. Every radar signal mattered. Every message carried weight. Every delay was interpreted not as caution, but as weakness. Nowhere was this tension more visible than in the Caribbean, where a small island, barely 90 miles from the coast of the United States, suddenly became the focal point of the most dangerous confrontation in human history. Cuba, newly aligned with the Soviet Union after its revolution, was seen by Washington as both a strategic threat and a symbolic challenge, proof that influence could spread even into America's own hemisphere. Moscow, meanwhile, viewed the island as a rare opportunity to alter the nuclear balance, placing missiles within immediate reach of American cities, and forcing a recalculation of power on a global scale. What followed was not a sudden crisis, but a slow and deliberate escalation of fear, miscalculation, and political pressure. It unfolded day by day, decision by decision, as leaders on both sides struggled to appear strong, decisive, and unyielding, without triggering the catastrophe they all claimed to fear. By the time the world realized how close it had come, the space for compromise was already shrinking. The machinery was already in motion, and history as we know it was balanced on a knife's edge. By mid-October of 1962, the tension that had been quietly building between the United States and the Soviet Union finally surfaced into the open. Not through speeches or declarations of war, but through photographs taken thousands of feet above the ground, revealing something Washington had long feared, but never expected to see so clearly. American reconnaissance flights over Cuba returned with unmistakable evidence. Soviet nuclear missile sites were under construction, carefully positioned in a way that would allow warheads to reach major American cities within minutes, fundamentally altering the strategic balance that had defined the Cold War until that moment. For President John F. Kennedy and the advisors gathered around him, the discovery created an immediate and nearly impossible dilemma. Every available response carried risk, escalation, miscalculation, or outright catastrophe. Yet doing nothing was equally unthinkable. A military strike could eliminate the missiles, but it might also provoke a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. A full invasion of Cuba could remove the threat entirely, but would almost certainly ignite a broader war that no one could control. Diplomatic pressure offered a slower path, one that relied on negotiation and restraint, but time was a luxury the situation no longer seemed to allow. As debates unfolded behind closed doors in the White House, the world outside remained unaware that history had entered one of its most fragile moments. Not balanced on ideology, not balanced on military power, but balanced on the ability of a small group of individuals to navigate fear without surrendering to it. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Soviet leadership viewed the situation through an entirely different lens. From their perspective, the placement of missiles in Cuba was not an act of aggression, but a necessary response to American missiles already stationed near Soviet borders. It was seen as a way to restore balance, to correct what they believed had become a dangerously uneven equation in nuclear power. Both sides believed they were acting defensively. Both sides believed escalation could be managed, contained, and controlled. Neither side fully understood just how narrow the margin for error had become. As American naval forces moved to enforce a blockade around Cuba, carefully labeled a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of war, the possibility of direct contact between American and Soviet forces became unavoidable. The Caribbean transformed into a pressure point, a confined space where a single misunderstanding could ignite global destruction. Soviet ships approached the blockade line. American commanders awaited orders with weapons ready. Submarine captains, cut off from clear communication, interpreted sonar signals, depth charges, and radio silence through standing instructions that assumed the worst. Every hour that passed increased the risk that events on the ground would outrun decisions made at the highest levels of power. Messages between Washington and Moscow moved slowly, filtered through diplomatic language that struggled to keep pace with military systems designed for rapid response, not careful reflection. Publicly, leaders projected calm. Privately, they confronted the possibility that they were no longer fully in control of the forces they had set in motion. The crisis did not hinge on a single dramatic moment. It unfolded through a series of decisions made under pressure, with incomplete information, where restraint required more courage than action, and hesitation carried consequences as real as aggression. By the time the world believed the danger had passed, the margins separating survival from catastrophe had already narrowed to a point where chance played as much a role as judgment. History would later remember the Cuban Missile Crisis as a success of diplomacy, but beneath that conclusion lay a far more unsettling truth. The world survived not because the system was safe, but because, this time, it did not fail. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe history is shaped as much by what didn't happen as by what did, consider subscribing. This channel explores the moments where the world stood on the edge and stepped back. As the crisis deepened, time itself became the most dangerous element of all. Every passing hour reduced the space for diplomacy, while increasing the influence of military systems designed to act faster than human reflection. Inside the White House, President Kennedy and his advisors operated under a constant sense of compression, fully aware that they were not simply responding to events, but racing against a chain of consequences that could unfold beyond their control if even a single decision was misunderstood. Meetings stretched late into the night, not because new ideas were emerging, but because the weight of each possible action was so immense that committing to any one of them felt irreversible. Every option carried a cost, every delay carried risk, and every decision threatened to close off all others. Military leaders argued that decisive action would project strength, restore credibility, and deter further escalation. Civilian advisors, however, warned that strength, once demonstrated, could trap both sides inside a cycle where backing down became politically and psychologically impossible. At the heart of the debate lay a paradox that defined the Cold War itself. Showing restraint could be interpreted as weakness, yet acting decisively could remove the final barriers preventing catastrophe. Across the ocean, the Soviet leadership faced its own narrowing window. American intentions were not interpreted through speeches or press statements, but through military signals, troop movements, and the tightening naval presence around Cuba. To Moscow, these signals suggested preparation, not negotiation. Communication between the two superpowers remained indirect and fragile, filtered through ambassadors, coded messages, and public broadcasts that concealed as much as they revealed. A dangerous gap opened between intention and perception. Neither side possessed a complete picture of the other's internal debates. Neither side could be certain which signals were deliberate and which were the result of confusion, delay, or internal disagreement. Meanwhile, the military machines continued to move. American forces escalated readiness levels. Strategic bombers were placed on higher alert. Missile crews received instructions that shortened response times and reduced the margin for hesitation. On the Soviet side, commanders were reminded of standing orders designed for worst-case scenarios, reinforcing a mindset where caution could be interpreted as failure. The most dangerous aspect of this moment was not aggression, but automation. Systems built to ensure rapid response began to limit the ability of leaders to pause, reconsider, or reverse course once certain thresholds were crossed. Decisions made at the top did not always travel instantly or clearly to the field. Actions taken by commanders in isolation could generate consequences that political leaders would only learn about after the fact. The crisis had entered a phase where control existed more in theory than in practice. What remained was a narrowing corridor of possibility, a brief window in which restraint, luck, and human judgment could still intersect before momentum carried events beyond recall. History would later compress these days into a simplified narrative of calm leadership and rational decision-making. But at the time, nothing felt stable. Everything felt temporary, and the world stood waiting, balanced between what had already been set in motion and what could still be stopped. By the time political leaders believed they were managing the crisis, control had already begun to slip quietly out of their hands. Not through dramatic rebellion or open defiance, but through the accumulated weight of procedures, standing orders, and systems designed to function precisely when human authority could no longer keep up. What had once been safeguards slowly became constraints. What had been designed to ensure survival now narrowed the space for choice. Far from cameras and conference rooms, military units on both sides operated under instructions that assumed communication might fail, leadership might be lost, and survival could depend on acting without confirmation. These instructions were not written in panic. They were written calmly, years earlier, by planners who believed they were preparing for the worst. In practice, this logic transformed caution into hesitation, and hesitation into perceived danger. In the Atlantic and the Caribbean, submarines became some of the most isolated and vulnerable participants in the crisis. Cut off from clear instructions, surrounded by unfamiliar signals, and unable to see the world above the surface, commanders were forced to interpret sonar pings, depth charges, and long stretches of radio silence through doctrines written for worst-case scenarios. Inside these steel vessels, deep beneath the ocean, time distorted. Minutes felt like hours. Silence felt like intent, and every unexplained sound carried meaning that could not be verified. Decisions were made that history would never record in full detail. Choices taken without knowing whether war had already begun, whether cities above were already burning, or whether restraint elsewhere still held. In these moments, the distance between misinterpretation and annihilation narrowed not to minutes, but to seconds. Above the oceans, reconnaissance flights continued to push boundaries, testing reactions, probing limits, and gathering information that was always incomplete by the time it arrived. Air defense systems tracked every movement with growing suspicion. Each unidentified blip on a radar screen forced operators to make judgments with lives and cities at stake. On land, missile crews maintained readiness levels that demanded absolute discipline. They lived inside routines designed to eliminate doubt, trained to execute orders without hesitation should confirmation arrive, even as the meaning of confirmation itself became increasingly ambiguous amid noise, delay, and fragmented intelligence. By this stage, the danger no longer lay solely in deliberate attack. It lay in the structure of the system itself. A system built to respond quickly did not distinguish between error and intent. A system designed to survive decapitation did not pause to ask whether decapitation had truly occurred. Speed became safety, doubt became liability, and hesitation became risk. In this environment, the line separating deterrence from automatic escalation blurred further with every passing hour. Human judgment was gradually displaced by processes that valued speed over certainty and reaction over reflection. Political leaders could issue statements of restraint, but they could not instantly rewrite the assumptions embedded in thousands of pages of military doctrine. Nor could they halt mechanisms already primed to react to the next signal, the next silence, or the next perceived threat. Every additional movement increased the risk that a local decision, made in isolation, would generate a chain reaction beyond anyone's ability to stop. This was the crisis beneath the crisis. Not the one discussed in meetings, not the one addressed in speeches, but the silent one unfolding inside machines, protocols, and human nerves stretched to their limits. By this stage, the survival of the world depended less on grand strategy and more on the ability of individuals, often unseen and unheard, to interpret ambiguous signals with restraint rather than fear. History would later focus on leaders, on speeches, and on agreements signed at the last moment. But in these hours, the fate of humanity rested far lower in the chain of command, in places where no cameras watched and no headlines would ever reach. As the crisis moved closer to its breaking point, the central question quietly shifted. It was no longer about whether nuclear war was possible. It was about whether it could still be actively prevented by human choice. The space for deliberate restraint had narrowed so dramatically that doing nothing began to feel as dangerous as doing something. Leaders on both sides found themselves suspended between two opposing fears: the fear that acting too forcefully would ignite a catastrophe beyond anyone's control, and the equally paralyzing fear that hesitation would be interpreted as weakness, encouraging the very outcome they were trying to avoid. In Washington, pressure mounted steadily. Military commanders warned that delay only increased vulnerability, arguing that every hour the missiles remained in place was an hour in which the balance of power tilted further out of alignment. Future options narrowed, risks multiplied, and the cost of restraint appeared to grow with every passing moment. Civilian advisors, however, focused on a different danger, one that could not be measured in missile ranges or readiness levels. They understood that once violence began, there would be no reliable mechanism to contain it. No guarantee that escalation could be paused, negotiated, or reversed once the first irreversible step had been taken. Nuclear war, they argued, was not a tool that could be used selectively. It was a process that, once initiated, would move faster than human judgment could follow. At the center of this tension stood President John F. Kennedy. He was acutely aware that history would one day judge his decisions without ever experiencing the fear, the uncertainty, or the incomplete information under which those decisions were being made. That judgment, he knew, would come regardless of whether the world survived. Across the ocean, Soviet leadership faced a mirror image of the same dilemma. American actions were interpreted through a lens shaped by suspicion, recent memory, and the presence of U.S. missiles stationed near Soviet borders. From Moscow's perspective, failing to respond decisively risked signaling weakness, not only to Washington, but to allies whose confidence depended on Soviet resolve. Messages exchanged between the two sides grew simultaneously more urgent and more ambiguous. Each sentence was carefully crafted, weighed for meaning, and filtered through diplomacy, yet still open to multiple interpretations. A dangerous gap widened between intention and perception. At lower levels of command, this uncertainty translated into heightened alertness and mounting psychological strain. Responsibility shifted downward, placing extraordinary pressure on individuals trained to execute orders, not to question the assumptions behind them. The true test of restraint did not appear in speeches, press conferences, or public declarations. It emerged in moments of silence, moments when no clear instruction arrived, moments when commanders were forced to decide whether to wait, to act, or to prepare for the worst, without knowing which choice carried the greater danger. Restraint in these moments required faith. Not faith in the enemy, but faith in the belief that caution would not be punished by catastrophe. It demanded the courage to accept vulnerability in the hope that the other side would do the same. This was not weakness. It was the most difficult form of strength imaginable, and at this stage of the crisis, that strength was being tested at the very limits of human judgment. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe history is shaped as much by what didn't happen as by what did, consider subscribing. This channel explores the moments where the world stood on the edge and stepped back. As the crisis stretched into days that felt longer than entire years, a strange and unnatural silence began to settle over decision-making rooms on both sides of the world. It was not the silence of calm. It was the silence born from the understanding that any word spoken, any order issued, or any signal misinterpreted could unleash consequences that could never be undone. This was the phase of the crisis where nothing dramatic appeared to happen on the surface, and yet everything was happening beneath it. Leaders waited, commanders watched, operators calculated, all of them aware that the absence of action did not mean the absence of danger. In Washington, the machinery of government continued to function, but every process now operated under the shadow of irreversible outcomes. Each document signed, each message sent, carried with it an invisible weight that pressed down on those responsible for sending it. Decisions were reviewed, then reviewed again, not because they were unclear, but because their consequences were final. In Moscow, similar pressures mounted. Leadership understood that appearing passive could be interpreted as weakness, not only by their adversary, but by their own military and their allies. In moments like this, perception mattered as much as reality, and perception, once formed, could not easily be undone. Between these centers of power, the military systems remained active, alert, and unforgiving. They were designed to interpret silence not as patience, but as uncertainty, and uncertainty as a potential signal of collapse or deception. Radar stations continued to scan the skies, hour after hour, night after night, searching for movement that might never come. Naval units maintained contact with hostile forces just beyond visual range, close enough to react, far enough to misjudge. Missile crews waited in confined spaces, rehearsing procedures they hoped would never be used, fully aware that if confirmation arrived, there would be no time for debate, hesitation, or reflection. The most dangerous element of this moment was that waiting itself began to feel unstable. Prolonged restraint created its own form of pressure, slowly eroding confidence and amplifying suspicion with every passing hour. Each side wondered whether the other was waiting for a better opportunity. Each side questioned whether patience was being mistaken for fear. Each side feared that silence might be interpreted not as caution, but as preparation. In this atmosphere, the smallest anomaly became dangerous. A delayed message, an unexpected movement, a technical malfunction. Any of these could shatter restraint, transforming uncertainty into action through sheer momentum. Human judgment, stretched thin by exhaustion, stress, and constant vigilance, now competed directly with systems that demanded clarity and speed. Machines did not grow tired, procedures did not hesitate, and protocols did not question intent. The crisis reached a point where survival depended not on bold decisions, but on the ability to endure ambiguity, to accept not knowing, and to resist the instinct to resolve uncertainty through force. This was not a moment of heroism. It was a moment of endurance. And under these conditions, endurance became the most fragile safeguard humanity possessed. As the crisis approached its most fragile threshold, the burden of preventing catastrophe began to shift quietly away from presidents, councils, and formal chains of command. It settled instead on individuals far removed from history books, people whose names would never appear in official summaries, yet whose decisions carried consequences measured in millions of lives. In command posts, submarines, radar stations, and missile silos, men waited under conditions of relentless tension. They had been trained to respond instantly, to follow procedures without hesitation, and to trust systems designed for clarity. Now they were confronted with uncertainty that no manual could fully resolve. The signals they received were incomplete, delayed, or open to interpretation. These individuals were not asked to debate ideology, strategy, or political intent. They were asked to decide something far simpler and far more terrifying. Whether what they were seeing meant the end had already begun. For a radar operator, a single unexpected signal could represent a technical anomaly, or it could represent the opening act of nuclear war. For a submarine commander, the sound of depth charges echoing through the hull could be a warning, a signal to surface. Or it could be interpreted as the first strike of a conflict already unfolding above the surface. For missile crews sealed inside reinforced facilities, silence from command carried its own meaning. It could mean restraint, or it could mean decapitation. The systems surrounding them offered procedures, not certainty. They provided steps to follow, checklists to complete, and confirmations to await. But they did not provide understanding. And in these moments, the difference between obedience and judgment became dangerously thin. Every individual understood that hesitation could be interpreted as failure, insubordination, or weakness. Careers could end. Courts-martial could follow. Lives could be lost. Yet they also understood, often without being able to articulate it, that blind obedience could erase everything they were sworn to protect. This internal conflict unfolded in seconds, under crushing psychological pressure, with no guarantee that choosing restraint would be rewarded rather than punished. What made these moments extraordinary was not heroism in the traditional sense. It was restraint exercised in the absence of reassurance, when no authority figure could step in and say, with confidence, that waiting was the right choice. These were not cinematic moments. There were no speeches, no applause, no recognition, only the quiet hum of machinery, the steady glow of instruments, and the sound of one's own breathing inside confined spaces where the future of the world felt unbearably close. History would later simplify these events, attributing survival to diplomacy, leadership, or strategy. But survival in these moments depended on something far more fragile. It depended on individuals choosing not to act, when every system around them was built to ensure that they would. By this stage of the crisis, the world no longer moved forward in hours or even in minutes. It moved in seconds, measured by human hesitation, mechanical delay, and the fragile space between signal and response. Time itself seemed to lose its familiar meaning. Across continents, the machinery of war stood fully awake, not advancing, not retreating, but waiting. Waiting in a state of readiness so complete, so absolute, that even the smallest disturbance could tip it into irreversible motion. What made this moment uniquely dangerous was not movement, but stillness. A stillness charged with expectation, where every system remained active, every weapon armed, and every procedure prepared to unfold at a moment's notice. In command centers, operators stared at instruments that no longer felt like tools or sources of information. They felt like verdicts waiting to be delivered. Each indicator remained frozen in a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time itself, forcing those watching to confront the possibility that the next change might be the last. No alarms sounded, no new orders arrived, and yet the absence of sound became its own form of pressure, amplifying every thought, every doubt, and every fear that had been building for days. Silence under these conditions was not calming. It was oppressive. It pressed inward, leaving no room for distraction and no relief from the awareness of what might come next. Leaders understood that this was the most dangerous point of all, because escalation rarely begins with intention. It begins with momentum. Momentum created not by decision, but by reaction. And reaction requires only the smallest push to become unstoppable. A misread signal, a delayed message, a moment of confusion, a human error, magnified by machines that possess no capacity for doubt, no instinct for restraint. In this suspended moment, restraint existed not as policy, not as doctrine, and not as strategy. It existed as a fragile human choice, a choice repeated again and again across countless locations, by individuals who would never know whether their restraint was being matched elsewhere. Each repetition reinforced the next. Each decision bought the world a few more seconds of existence. What made this moment almost unbearable was the knowledge that no one could be certain it would hold. Every system had already been tested. Every assumption had been stretched to its limits. And now the only thing preventing collapse was the collective endurance of people choosing patience over certainty. For civilians around the world, this moment passed unnoticed. It unfolded behind closed doors, beneath classified ceilings, and inside rooms that would never appear in history books. Ordinary life continued under skies that concealed how close they were to burning. Children went to school, shops opened, radios played music, all while the future balanced on decisions being made far from view. But for those inside the system, time felt distorted, compressed, and unbearably heavy. Hours felt endless, seconds felt decisive. Every passing moment carried the unspoken question of whether restraint would continue to hold. It felt as if the future itself had paused, suspended between outcomes, waiting to see whether humanity was capable of surviving its own creations. This was not victory. It was not resolution. It was survival by suspension. A world balanced not on strength, not on power, but on restraint. And everyone involved understood one final truth. This balance could not last forever. Eventually, the moment passed. Not because the danger disappeared, not because the system corrected itself, and not because the world suddenly became wiser. The moment passed because a fragile chain of decisions, hesitations, and quiet acts of restraint managed, this time, to hold just long enough for momentum to slow. Not stop, just slow. Messages were exchanged, often incomplete, often delayed, often stripped of certainty. Signals stabilized, not because they became clear, but because they stopped changing fast enough to trigger automatic responses. Orders were clarified, not perfectly, not universally, but enough to interrupt the rhythm that had been carrying the world toward irreversible collapse. And the machinery that had stood ready, fully armed, fully alert, fully prepared to execute the unthinkable, remained for the moment suspended. History would later describe this as a resolution, a success of diplomacy, a triumph of leadership, a moment where rational minds prevailed. But for those who lived through it, the dominant feeling was not relief, it was exhaustion, a deep physical exhaustion that followed not victory, but survival. Survival achieved through the narrowest possible margin between action and restraint, between certainty and doubt, between obedience and judgment. Those who had waited did not celebrate. Those who had hesitated did not feel heroic. They felt the weight of how close everything had come to ending, and how easily it could have gone the other way. In the days that followed, the world slowly returned to something resembling normal. Leaders gave speeches. Statements were released. Cameras captured handshakes and formal expressions of calm. A narrative began to take shape, a narrative suggesting that control had been maintained, that systems had worked as intended, that humanity had guided itself safely through the most dangerous moment in its history. What that narrative quietly concealed was how close the world had come to slipping beyond anyone's control. How much depended not on presidents or councils, but on individuals far removed from history books and headlines. Radar operators, submarine commanders, missile crews, officers staring at instruments that offered data, but not certainty. People who chose to wait when systems urged them to act. People who paused when hesitation carried professional, personal, and moral risk. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended without nuclear war, but it did not end cleanly. It left behind a world permanently altered by proximity to disaster. A world forced to confront an uncomfortable truth, that its survival depended not only on power, not only on deterrence, not only on strategy or technology, but on restraint exercised under unimaginable pressure. In the years that followed, military doctrines were rewritten, communication channels were expanded, safeguards were added, hotlines were installed, procedures were refined, all in an attempt to ensure that such a moment would never occur again. And yet beneath these reforms, the same reality remained. The systems still existed. The weapons still waited. The logic of rapid response was still embedded deep within global security structures. And the margin for error remained frighteningly thin. What ultimately saved the world was not technology. It was not deterrence. It was not even diplomacy alone. It was human hesitation, the courage to pause when action seemed inevitable, the willingness to doubt when certainty was demanded, the decision, repeated again and again, across different places, by different people, not to act when action appeared irreversible. This is why the Cuban Missile Crisis matters, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did, because it revealed that the greatest danger humanity faces is not its capacity for destruction, but its confidence in systems that leave no room for doubt. And it leaves us with a question that does not belong to the past, a question that remains alive, quietly waiting as long as these systems exist. If placed in the same position again, if faced with the same uncertainty, if asked once more to choose between speed and restraint, would we still choose to wait? History is not shaped only by what is done, it is shaped by what is stopped. And sometimes the future of the world depends on the courage to say nothing and wait.